Imagine being 7 years old, standing in your backyard, so frustrated with the world that you shake your fist at the universe and demand answers. Now imagine the universe actually answering. What happens next? For most of us, nothing. But for today's guest, that moment changed everything. Today I'm sitting down with Kristine Madera. Kristine is a novelist whose work explores what happens when we leave familiar systems behind and allow ourselves to be shaped, sometimes uncomfortably, by other ways of living, believing, and belonging. She's been an exchange student in Australia, a teacher in Japan, a solo backpacker through China and Russia as the Soviet Union was unraveling, a Peace Corps volunteer in Papua New Guinea, and a volunteer at Mother Teresa's Home for the Dying in Calcutta. But before any of that, at age 7, she had an experience she now calls unity consciousness, a profound sense that everything was connected and that the world was far more complex in her life than she had been taught. That experience and curiosity it unleashes the closest thing she has to a guiding code, and it led her to write her novel, God in Drag, which grapples with embodiment, mortality, and spiritual disorientation, all rooted in her time in Calcutta. By the end of this episode, you won't just understand the quote, you understand how a single moment of childhood wonder can become the thread that weaves together a lifetime of crossing borders, writing stories, and discovering that we are all, as she puts it, divine in disguise, walking one another home. Let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Christine.
Thank you, Wisdom. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, Christine, I'd love for us to go right back to that backyard. You were 7 years old, shaking your fist at the universe, demanding answers. What was the question and what had happened? What were you feeling that made you so desperate for a response?
Not entirely sure the exact incident that caused me to shake my fist at the universe, but it was the sense that the world around me was just really it didn't make any sense. It seemed mean. It seemed, just like this energy of fighting within people all the time. And it was just a very unpleasant place to be in. Not that I had an unpleasant family. It's just the whole vibration of the world around me. And I could feel all of that, like the difference between what people were saying and what they were thinking, the undercurrents of things that were happening in my life and in world events and things like that. And it was a very strong, powerful, uncomfortable feeling in the world. And I think that was something must have happened that kind of brought that to a head. And I was like, I am done. Like, you got to figure out, you got to tell me why I'm here, or I need to be done because this place is crazy. These people are nuts. I don't know what I'm doing here. This seems like a waste of my time. And so when I went out there and I shook my fist at the universe and I said that, all of a sudden I had this experience where like I melted away and I was unity consciousness, and I could see or understand that what I was supposed to do, like, what the point of my life was to embody that unity consciousness and let it live itself through me and live my life trusting that. And trusting that what I was seeing and feeling in the surface level of life was not not all of life. And it caused me to become very curious about what is this larger experience that we have of life and the unifying consciousness beneath it, versus what we're kind of told is what we're supposed to be thinking and believing and doing, and what's supposed to be important, which seems very shallow and surface. So that at the time was kind of what I was thinking. That's kind of a weird kid. And I thought very deeply about a lot of things.
Yeah, and then the universe answered. You call it unity
It did.
consciousness now, but you didn't have a language for it then. Walk me into that moment. What did you see, feel, or know in those brief moments that you hadn't known before?
I had the sense that I really was. I mean, I'd always like knew that I was connected to something more than just the body and experience, but I had that real visceral feeling of what that was, of being connected to everything. And then of the very simple, it seemed at the time, idea that all of what the purpose of my life was to allow that wholeness to live through me and to trust it as I lived my life, and to trust that more than I trusted all the things I learned about what I was supposed to do. So all of that came in a flash and a quick experience and a deep understanding, although it would have been hard to, I understood it as a feeling and an understanding more so than the language of it. Because the language of it came later. There was nothing in my life that had that kind of idea or language attached that I could bring into the experience and say, oh, that's what that was. It was really an experience where I had to learn and figure out the language for it as I went along and how to live that as I went along.
Yeah. You said once you glimpse that the story you've been handed isn't the whole story, curiosity becomes unavoidable. My question is, what was the story you had been handed, and what did that new curiosity feel like in the days and weeks after? Was it exciting, unsettling, or both?
Well, it was both. So the history or the story I was handed. So I'm an American. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in a Christian household. So I had the religious story. I had the American dream story that you're supposed to go to school, go to college, get a career, work for 45 years or so, retire, blah blah blah, have kids, and that whole thing of what you're supposed to do. Which it's fine, but it was just kind of felt a little empty. And so those were some of the stories that I was handed, and that life was supposed to work a certain way. That whole American dream idea is if you play by the rules and you do certain things, you will inevitably be successful, which is not actually true in any way, shape, or form, but it's the idea that we're handed. And this other idea, this new energy coming in was really like anything is possible. And all these values about, you're supposed to do this hard work for 45 years so that you have money when you retire, and all this stuff is just like, it's fine if that's what you want to do, but there's so much more to life. And, there's so much more to understanding who you are and how the world works. And I'd always been curious, but what I really started doing after that is trying to understand my life. Because as soon as that experience ended, I felt this big chasm between how I felt in that experience and the very surface level flimsiness of ordinary life. And I recognized how limited my view of the world and my view of myself was. And so my first kind of assignment was how do I access a greater understanding of myself and the world so that I'm not trapped in, because I felt really trapped in the ideas that I was taught, like, is that's your whole reality. And if you never question it, it continues to be your reality throughout your life. But if you question it, then you can get a larger sense of reality. So I used to look at the encyclopedias, and I would find some exotic place on the planet and read about it and imagine my life there as, a kid. And I would make friends with that kid part of my life, and we would talk to each other, and I would try to understand life from their perspective and understand it from my perspective. And like, well, what would my life be like if I was, and my favorite one was being like in a Bedouin, like a Bedouin nomadic tribe, and my version of what that might be, and how different that was. But to understand, that how I experienced life was not the only way to do it. And if I was raised in this other way, I would have this other set of values, this other set of experiences, this other set of expectations. And how did that compare and contrast with what I experienced about me to give me a larger experience of the world? Because I was still caught in my little suburban lifestyle. I couldn't just get on a plane and go. So I had to do this through books and imagination. And I've always had that curiosity my whole life. So it's expanded from that to actual travel, to talking with people that I don't understand, to not understand, people that I don't know whose experiences are very different than mine. And of reading about people and places that are very different than mine, and asking myself questions that really begin to open up new ideas to expand that realm of what's possible. And even being in that sense of curiosity allows you to be open to the idea and let go of the fear that, everything that I have learned may not actually be true. It may not even, it's even if it is a form of truth, it's part of multiple experiences of truth, and it is not the truth.
Let's take a quick pause. If you're enjoying this conversation and want more thought-provoking ideas straight to your inbox, join the Relatable Wisdom email list. It's free, quick, and filled with bite-sized insights, inspiring quotes, and behind-the-scenes reflections from our guests. Just head to relatablewisdom.com/join. That is relatablewisdom.com/join, or tap the link in the show notes. And hey, subscribing to the podcast helps more than you think, and it's free.
So if you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening. All right, let's get back to the conversation.
Yeah. That curiosity sent you around the world. Japan, China, Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed, Papua New Guinea with the Peace Corps. When you arrived in these places, was it about testing what you had lived since a child, or were you just following the curiosity without fully understanding why?
Little bit of both, but the trip that I took through China, Russia, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, that trip was one that was very specific to trying to figure out how this trust in unity consciousness worked. So I graduated from college like I was supposed to. I went to go teach English in Japan, and on the way home from Japan, they would give you either your ticket or the same amount of money to buy a ticket somewhere else. So
Yeah.
I went to the place that scared me the most. So I flew to Beijing because this was back in um, the early 1990s. So, it was just starting to open up. That was like the KFC had just landed there. But I think there was one 3-star hotel. I mean, it wasn't like this international capital that it is now. And so I went there with my backpack, and it was really about learning to trust, like letting go of what I knew, because I knew nothing about China. I had my guidebook, but that was it. But to trust this flow of this deeper intelligence rather than the things that I've learned to know and trust kind of in my life and in my mind. And so I traveled around China for about 6 weeks by myself with a backpack, and just kind of following the flow of how life opened for me. And then the same thing, getting on the train and going to Moscow during the fall of the Soviet Union when everything was in disarray. And even my guidebook was basically useless because everything had changed between the time I bought that guidebook and the time I arrived in Moscow. So I really had to, tap into those deeper currents and say, okay, so then what do I do now? And follow that flow of consciousness to guide me to situations that were helpful and supportive as I traveled. And it really taught me how to trust those deeper currents, because up until then I had been doing it, but it was kind of a theoretical experience because everywhere I was, even in Japan, was something that I could learn about and follow what I've learned about with some sense of that undercurrent, but not like the entire having to trust the undercurrent entirely by itself, which is what I had to do during that trip.
Yeah. I'd love for us to go to Calcutta. You volunteered at Mother Teresa's home for the dying. That's a place where the boundaries between life and death, suffering and grace are impossibly thin. What did that place teach you about unity you had first felt as a child? Did it challenge it, deepen it, or complicate it?
Well, India in and of itself is a pretty complicated, challenging place. Because you have you have deep suffering, and you have a tradition of really expansive, open um, spirituality or religion, and those two things operate side by side and within each other. So within looking at this hospice of seeing, people in extreme pain and extreme distress and suffering as they were leaving this world. There was also, for many people, I mean, some people were really deeply in that distress, and they were in pain, and I can imagine that and see that. And then some people were really, even if they were in that much pain and that much distress, in this very deep sense of peace. And you could really see that whatever it was that was alive in them was walking them through the process of dying while they were
Yeah.
in this deep state of equanimity about, well, this is just simply the process of being alive and moving toward the end of that life. And so you had some people who were in um, deeply suffering, and some people who were in this state of almost bliss in the process. And it was interesting to see. And the same thing with the people who were there. There were some people who were working there who, you could tell were really responding to the distress, and some people who were attending to people in distress while radiating this extraordinary sense of compassion and love, and knowing that this was all part of the process of consciousness living itself through human form.
Your novel, it's called God in drag. You turn that experience into your novel. That title alone is a provocation. Why that title? And I'm curious, what did writing fiction allow you to explore about that time that, writing a memoir or reflection never could?
Part of the, I'll get to the title in a moment, but the writing process, it was a big trip. We spent, my husband and I were both there at the same time, and we spent about 5 months in India and then a few months in Sri Lanka and Nepal. But um, India, it's a big, overwhelming country. And in order to process my experience, because I tend to go a little more slowly with that processing, and especially the experience at Home for the Dying, writing has always been the best way for me to process it. And it was easier and more fun to process it through fictional characters interacting with each other than through trying to remember my own experience, even though I brought my experience into it. And the character, Micah, who's the main character, had been with me before I went to India. He just kind of found his spot when we were there. So writing it through fiction was interesting, and was more interesting and more fun than writing it as a memoir. But the title came from a story told by Ram Dass. And in this story, and he's had this quote attributed to him, but the story that the quote was attributed to was a different story. This is one I heard during a lecture that he gave. And he said that it was a relationship between him and his mother. And he and his mother, they had their roles. They were mother and son. And yet sometimes they would slip out of those roles, and they would be like two people who were God in drag. So these two people who were kind of consciousness in human form, walking each other home in different ways through this relationship of mother and son, and of two beings companioning each other. And I think the title God in Drag for me was really wanting to express that we are all the divine in disguise. And also in the story, you can see that the characters are walking each other forward. They're walking and companioning each other through their life experience. And it spoke back to that quote and that story by Ram Dass really powerfully to me. And I like the title in part because it's thought-provoking enough that everybody brings what they think the story might be to that because of the title. And I think everybody is surprised about what the story is relative to the title.
You have crossed borders, right? Your whole life, you move from countries to countries. But what about the borders inside you?
Mhm.
Was there a time when an old identity, something you believed about yourself or the world, had to die so something new could be born?
Yeah, that is kind of like my life theme. So
Okay, tell me about it.
I do that a lot. I've been a hypnotherapist, so I've done that, for other people as well. Um, And let's see. Yeah, I mean, this happens all the time for me. And how this happens, maybe it's better to talk about how it happens,
Tell me.
because I think this is what people might relate to is, I generally experience the world through energy and sensation in my body and different things. So I'm fairly in tune with my body. And that was a process because it had been really painful to feel everything that I feel. And so learning to be able to feel was a process. And then learning to be able to sit with what I was feeling and let it unwind, understanding it as its own story, like a block or a blob of emotion that tied in with a story that wanted to be seen and released so that a new story could come through. And so I've done this so many times, it's just, I do this by second nature now. But what happens is, you enter into a situation, or maybe you're going to work, or maybe you're going to have a conversation with somebody you've never met or something, and you get this like feeling in your body. So whether it's, fluttering in your stomach, or like a seizing in your chest, or a fuzziness in your head or something, and recognizing that those are old stories, in the shape of old sensations and emotions that usually have stories attached to them, oftentimes stories that we do not even remember because they're so deep in our experience. And usually we ignore them. We, try to take a walk to dispel them, or, do something to make them go away, when the transformational process is really about allowing yourself to feel the sensation, to feel the experience, to not enter into the story, except maybe to understand, the challenges within the story that are connected to that uh, physical sensation or experience, and then ride the wave of that sensation. So it comes up. If you attend to it without trying to change it, you let it self-express itself in you, it will get very uncomfortable, usually pretty quickly. But if you can sit through that discomfort, that story unwinds, that emotion and energy unwinds, and it releases the story with it. Now, there might be other things underneath it, but this is a really effective way of letting go of old stories that don't involve recreating stories in the mind. Because we try to solve story with story, and it doesn't really work. Stories are alive in the body, they want to express. And when you let it express, you open up space for something new to come in. And that's the beautiful space.
Yeah. For someone listening who feels like they're living a script they didn't write, who suspects there's more but doesn't know how to find it, what's the first step? Not a trip around the world, but one small thing they can do this week to start paying attention.
I think, the first, I'd give people a couple of suggestions. One is to look outside of your normal thought processes and the normal things you look to for truth. So usually people look at the same news sources, they follow the same personalities on social media, they talk to the same people. We tend to prefer things that mirror back to us what we already believe and what we already think because it makes us feel comfortable. That comfort is an illusion. It's this scripted little story that we try to live within to manage the sensations in our body and keep them from disturbing us. And so what I would say is to look outside of your own bubble for something different, not necessarily something provocative, but if you're used to looking through, a particular lens, like a particular religious lens, if you're a highly religious person and you tend to go through your own religious lens, look at a different religion and what are some of their values and see where some of those things align with yours and look and see how some of those value systems were created. And to find an understanding of that, you don't have to change religions, but to open yourself up to the idea that there is more to that story of religion than the one that you have been cultivating within yourself. There's a larger truth to that. Or if you tend to look at everything through the lens of your work, look in something that is a little bit larger. Like if you're very scientific, look at something that's a little more, a little more woo-woo, a little more metaphysical or something, because that's always
Yeah.
fun.
Woo.
And there's a real convergence of spirituality and science. But if you're too locked in one, you don't allow yourself to see the other. And really, when we open our story up to more, is when we can open ourselves up to being more than who we are. And so I would say those two things become look outside, or I guess I didn't get to the second. Look outside yourself and your bubble for something that's interesting to you. Notice what comes up because you're going to be, bringing up the stories. It's like, oh, I can't believe that, can't trust that. That's dangerous because it's unfamiliar. And sit with that and let yourself sit with the discomfort of that and let it unwind. And do that over and over so that the feelings of discomfort that come up don't feel scary. Don't feel like it's something that it needs to be, conquered. Do this, sitting alone at home, not when you're in the middle of an interaction, because then you can look around yourself and say, okay, I'm in my safe room. I'm in my safe place. I'm feeling this feeling and I'm still okay. And practicing those two things, and then when that feeling unwinds and kind of comes into a sense of peace, and there may be multiple layers to that, just imagine whatever makes you happy or gives you peace, whether it's, holding a puppy or sitting at the beach, imagine something that creates a really good feeling to help, fill up the vacuum of what you have let go of when you let go of that story and that sensation. And that's what I practice in most of my life. So if you just do that, you can really completely change your inner story, which helps to completely change your outer story, not necessarily the nutsy boltsy pieces, but how you experience your life.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because all the social platforms are designed to show you the same thing, and so you have to go out of your way and say, I need to find something different. Because I'll give an example. If you're a Democrat, all the things you see on your platform is Democrat stuff, all the Democrats winning and making sense. If you're a Republican, all the things you see are stuff that and so there's no way you're exposed to something out of the ordinary.
Yeah. No, and it's totally true. And then part of that social media too is to try to get you to demonize the other side.
Yeah.
It's insane. That's not how we can build a cohesive world or even an inner system, because it teaches you in your body that what is uncomfortable or scary is wrong or bad. And, it divides us within ourselves. Coming into that place where you can come into your own sense of inner unity helps you recognize that we're a lot more unified in America. You talked about Republicans and Democrats at a people level, and around the world at a human level than our politics and our surface level and our governments would have us believe.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that recommendation, Kristine. Where can listeners learn more about the work you're doing and also get a copy of your book, God in Drag?
God and Drag is available on Amazon, so you can go ahead and get it there. It's available through the whole array of countries. So if you have Amazon available to you, you should be able to get it. And you can find out more about me and other books coming up and things at my website, KristineMadera.com. And that's Kristine with a K, Kristine. Madera is like a mad era, Madera.com.
Yeah, I'll put a link mentioned in the description so listeners can just click and go directly to the site. Thank you so much, Kristine. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, Wisdom. It's been wonderful talking with you too.
Yeah, you're welcome. You've been listening to Relatable Wisdom, and I've been your host, Wisdom Okonkwo. You've been listening to the podcast where every story, quote, and insight helps you see life a little differently. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow the show on your favorite podcast app and share it with someone who would love the conversation. For more inspiring voices and timeless wisdom, visit relatablewisdom.com. Until next time, keep living, learning, and collecting wisdom that matters most to you.